The year is 312 BC. A man named Lucius Pavo is standing knee-deep in mud outside the city walls of Rome, watching the most expensive road in the Republic fall apart. It's been raining for 3 days. The Via Latina, the old trade route south, has turned into a river of brown sludge. Carts sink to their axles. Oxen strain and slip. A merchant's wagon carrying amphorae of wine tips sideways, and 2,000 sesterces of Falernians spill into the muck. Lucius doesn't move to help. He's watching the road itself. Specifically, he's watching what the water does. It doesn't flow off. It pools. It sits. It seeps into every crack and joint between the stones. And as the carts roll through, those cracks get wider. The stones shift. The foundation underneath, packed earth, nothing more, turns to soup. This road was built 8 years ago. It's already dying. And somewhere in Rome, a blind politician named Appius Claudius Caecus has just announced that he's going to build a new road. From Rome to Capua, 212 kilometers of highway through marshes, mountains, and enemy territory. Everyone thinks he's lost his mind. Lucius Pavo thinks he might be the only man in Rome who understands what that road actually needs. Here's what everyone in Rome knew about roads in 312 BC. You clear the brush. You flatten the earth. You lay down stones. You pack them tight. Done. This is how roads had been built for centuries. The Etruscans built roads this way. The Greeks built roads this way. Every civilization around the Mediterranean built roads this way. And every single one of those roads turned to mud every time it rained. The reason is simple, but nobody had figured it out yet. Water. Not the water that falls on top of the road. That's obvious. You can see it. You can sweep it away. The problem is the water you can't see. The water that seeps down through the cracks. The water that soaks into the foundation. The water that sits there, invisible, waiting. When a cart rolls over dry stone on dry earth, the weight distributes evenly. The stones press down. The earth pushes back. Everything holds. But when that earth is wet, the weight of the cart pushes down, and the earth has nowhere to go but sideways. The stones shift. Gaps open. More water gets in. More shifting. More gaps. It's a death spiral. And it happens slowly enough that nobody connects cause and effect. Romans just accepted that roads wore out. That's what roads did. You built them. You used them. You rebuilt them every few years. The cost was simply part of doing business. Lucius Pavo had spent 15 years building roads the old way. He'd watched them fail. He'd rebuilt the same stretches 3, 4, 5 times. And somewhere along the way, he'd started paying attention to something everyone else ignored. The roads that lasted longest weren't the ones with the best stones on top. They were the ones that happened to be built on ground that drained well. When Appius Claudius announced the Via Appia project, he wasn't thinking about drainage. He was thinking about war. Rome was fighting the Samnites, a confederation of tribes in the mountains southeast of Rome. The war had been grinding on for decades, and Rome was losing. Not on the battlefield, but in logistics. Roman armies could march south, win battles, and then get stuck. The existing roads turned to mud. Supply wagons couldn't get through. Armies starved. Victories meant nothing if you couldn't hold the ground afterward. Appius understood that roads were weapons. A proper highway from Rome to Capua would let legions move in any weather. It would let supplies flow continuously. It would turn southern Italy from a quagmire into Roman territory. But Appius was a politician, not an engineer. He could see what needed to be built. He couldn't see how to build it. The man he hired to figure that out was an engineer named Quintus Horatius. Experienced, respected, expensive. Quintus looked at the route and saw exactly what everyone else saw. Marshes, mountains, and 200 kilometers of bad terrain. His solution was straightforward. Bigger stones, thicker layers, more workers, more money. Lucius Pavo was 43 years old and had never led a major project. He was assigned to Quintus's team as a section supervisor, one of dozens of men responsible for a few kilometers of road each. His section happened to include the Pontine Marshes. The Pontine Marshes were the worst terrain on the entire route. 50 kilometers of swamp stretched between Rome and the coast. The ground was never dry. Even in summer, you could dig down a hand's breadth and hit water. In winter, the whole area flooded, turning into a shallow lake that could swallow a man up to his chest. And then there was the sickness. The Romans didn't know what caused it. They called it bad air, malaria, because they noticed that people who breathed the marsh air at night often fell ill. What they were actually breathing were clouds of mosquitoes carrying a parasite that would kill more workers than any accident ever could. The symptoms started slowly. Chills, sweating, a fever that came and and went, came and went, until you couldn't tell if you were hot or cold. Men would work through it at first, thinking it would pass. It didn't pass. The fevers got worse. Some men shook so violently they couldn't hold tools. Others became delirious, talking to people who weren't there. And then, usually within a few weeks of the first symptoms, they died. Lucius lost 11 men in the first month. Not to accidents, not to injuries, just to the air. The survivors wrapped cloth around their faces. They burned fires at night, hoping the smoke would drive away whatever poison hung in the atmosphere. Nothing helped. By the end of the second month, Lucius was requesting replacement workers every week. Fresh men from Rome would arrive, and within days half of them would be lying in makeshift shelters, shivering and sweating, and waiting to see if they would live or die. The work continued anyway. Quintus's plan for crossing the marshes was simple. Build a raised causeway, pile enough rock and earth to lift the road above the water level, then pave the top the same way you'd pave any road. It was the obvious solution. It was also completely wrong. They started in spring, when the water levels were lowest. Hundreds of workers hauled rocks from the hills, loaded them onto carts, dragged them into the marsh. The carts got stuck constantly. Wheels sank into the muck. Axles snapped. Men waded through waist-deep water carrying stones on their backs because there was no other way to move them. By early summer, they had built a causeway nearly a kilometer long. It rose a full meter above the water level. From a distance, it looked solid, permanent, like the beginning of something that would last. Then the rains came. Lucius was there when it started. He was standing on the causeway, checking the alignment of the stones, when he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not much, just a slight settling, like the road was exhaling. He looked down. Water was seeping up between the paving stones. That shouldn't have been possible. The causeway was above the water level. The water should have been below them, not coming up through the road itself. But the causeway wasn't floating on the marsh. It was sinking into it. All that rock, all that weight, was pressing down on a foundation that had never been solid in the first place. The marsh bottom was just more water mixed with rotting vegetation, and it was giving way. What they'd built in April was level with the water by July. By August, sections of the causeway were actually below the surface, water flowing over them like a river over a submerged rock. Quintus refused to accept it. He ordered more rock, more height, build it higher, make it heavier, force it to stay up. It was like trying to float a stone by making it bigger. The more they piled on, the faster it sank. Workers began calling the marsh the mouth because it swallowed everything they fed it and was never satisfied. 3 men died when a section collapsed without warning. The stones shifted, the ground opened, and they dropped into water that looked knee-deep but wasn't. The mud underneath was soft enough to swallow a man whole. By the time anyone reached them, they were gone. The marsh had taken them the same way it was taking the road. Lucius watched all of this happen. He said nothing. He was a section supervisor. His job was to execute orders, not question them. But in his own section, on the eastern edge of the marshes where the ground was slightly firmer, he started experimenting. Lucius's first idea was simple. If water was the enemy, keep it out. He ordered his workers to dig a shallow trench around the construction area. The idea was to intercept groundwater before it could reach the road foundation, drain the immediate area, build on dry ground. It didn't work. The trench filled with water almost immediately. Not flowing water, just seepage, rising up from below, appearing faster than they could remove it. The water table in the marsh wasn't something you could redirect with a simple ditch. It was everywhere, all the time, pressed up against the surface like a living thing trying to break through. His second idea was to dig deeper, create a proper drainage channel, lined with rocks, that would carry water away to lower ground. But there was no lower ground. The marsh was flat for kilometers in every direction. Water couldn't flow anywhere because there was nowhere for it to flow to. His workers started looking at him the way they'd looked at Quintus, another supervisor with another plan that wouldn't work. Another man who thought he could outsmart the marsh. Lucius didn't argue with them. He just kept thinking. The problem wasn't the water on top. That was obvious, but it wasn't what was killing the roads. The problem was the water underneath, the water that soaked into the foundation and turned solid ground into mud. You couldn't keep that water out. It was everywhere. It would find a way in, no matter what you did. So what if you stopped trying to keep it out? What if you let it in, and then let it back out again? Lucius's third attempt started differently. Instead of trying to block water, he focused on moving it. He dug trenches again, but this time he dug them parallel to the road, one on each side, and he dug them with a slight angle. Not much, maybe a finger's width of drop over 10 meters. meters, but enough that water would flow toward one end instead of sitting still. Then he did something his workers thought was insane. Instead of packing the earth flat where the road would go, he built it up in the middle, a gentle curve, highest in the center, sloping down toward the trenches on either side. "You're building a hump," one of his workers said. "Carts will tip over." "No, they won't. The slope is too gentle to notice, but water will notice." They didn't believe him. They built it anyway, because he was the supervisor, and they wanted to get paid. When the next rain came, Lucius walked his section while everyone else took shelter. The water hit the road surface and ran. It didn't pool. It didn't sit. It flowed down the gentle slope toward the edges, dropped into the trenches, and drained away. The road surface was wet for perhaps an hour after the rain stopped. Then it was dry. He walked over to Quintus's section. The water was still pooling, still seeping, still doing what water always did. Lucius had solved half the problem, but only half. The curved surface and the drainage trenches handled water that fell on top of the road, but water would still seep down through the gaps between the paving stones. It would still get into the foundation, and once it was there, it would do the same damage it always did, unless the foundation could drain too. This was the part that took Lucius months to figure out. He tried different things, packing the foundation tighter. That made it worse because tight-packed earth held water better. Mixing sand into the earth, that helped a little, but not enough. Laying wooden planks under the stones, the wood rotted within a season. The breakthrough came when he was watching workers unload rocks from a cart. Big rocks, irregular shapes, tumbled together in a pile, and he noticed that water from a recent rain was draining through the pile easily, disappearing into the gaps between the stones. The pile was full of holes, and those holes let water escape. What if the foundation wasn't packed earth at all? What if it was loose rocks with gaps between them, gaps that would let water drain through instead of trapping it? He started with a layer of large stones, big, irregular rocks, each the size of a man's head or larger. He didn't pack them tight. He left gaps between them. His workers definitely thought he was mad now. "You're building a road on a pile of loose rocks. Keep working." The loose rocks created channels, spaces where water could flow sideways, toward the drainage trenches, instead of sitting trapped underneath the road surface. He covered the large stones with a layer of smaller rocks, each the size of a fist. These filled some of the gaps, but not all of them. Water could still seep down and through. Above that came a layer of gravel mixed with lime, denser, but still porous, still able to drain. And finally, the paving stones, cut flat, fitted tight, curved to match the camber he'd built into every layer below. 4 layers, each one serving a purpose. The paving stones for the surface traffic, the gravel for stability, the small rocks for drainage, the large rocks for deep drainage, and under it all the trenches carrying the water away. A road that didn't fight water, a road that moved water, a road that let water pass through and out and away, instead of letting it sit and rot the foundation from within. The rains came heavy that autumn. Quintus's sections, the raised causeways, continued their slow collapse. What had been above water in spring was now below water, and the new sections being built were sinking even faster than the old ones. Workers spent more time rebuilding than building. Morale collapsed along with the road. Men got sick, got injured, got killed. The project fell behind schedule by weeks, then months. Appius Claudius sent inspectors. They walked the entire route, section by section, noting progress and problems. They saw the causeway sections, half submerged and crumbling. They saw the work crews, depleted by disease and desertion. They saw a project that was failing, and then they reached the eastern edge of the marsh where Lucius Pavo had his 3-kilometer stretch. The road was dry. The drainage trenches were flowing. The paving stones sat level and stable on their layered foundation, while everything around it turned to swamp. This one section looked like it had been built on solid ground. The head inspector was a military tribune named Gaius Servilius. He walked Lucius's section twice. He stopped and examined the drainage trenches. He crouched down at the edge of the road where the layers were visible. Large stones at the bottom, smaller stones above. Gravel, then pavement. "Who designed this?" "I did." "On whose authority?" Lucius hesitated. The honest answer was, no one's. He'd been given a section to build, and he'd built it the way he thought it should be built. He'd ignored the official plans. He'd experimented with public funds. He'd taken risks that weren't his to take. That was probably a violation of about 6 different regulations, possibly more. "The design works. he said finally. That's what matters. Gaius Servilius looked at him for a long moment. His expression revealed nothing. Then he walked back to the inspection party and said something to the others that Lucius couldn't hear. 2 days later, Lucius was summoned to Rome. Appius Claudius Caecus was 61 years old and had been blind for nearly a decade. The blindness came on gradually, then all at once. Some said it was a curse from the gods, punishment for his political sins. He'd angered the old aristocratic families by giving voting rights to the poor, by appointing the sons of freedmen to the Senate. Others said it was simply age, the failing of a body that had worked too hard for too long. Whatever the cause, by the time the Via Appia project started, Appius could barely distinguish light from dark. He conducted all his business by voice, relying on secretaries to read documents and describe scenes. But his mind was as sharp as ever, maybe sharper. Without sight to distract him, he'd learned to listen, not just to words, but to hesitations, to breathing, to the small sounds people make when they're not sure what to say. Lucius had never met him. Few engineers had. Appius worked through layers of subordinates and bureaucrats. The fact that Lucius had been summoned directly was unusual, possibly dangerous. The meeting was in Appius's study, a room lined with scrolls he could no longer read. Appius sat in a plain chair, his clouded eyes fixed on nothing. 2 secretaries stood nearby, but he waved them silent when Lucius entered. "Describe your road to me." Lucius described it. The trenches, the camber, the 4 layers, the gaps between the rocks, the way water moved through the system instead of being trapped. Appius listened without interrupting. His blank eyes never moved, but Lucius had the uncomfortable feeling that he was being watched more carefully than he'd ever been watched in his life. When Lucius finished, there was a long silence. "Everyone else is fighting the water," Appius said finally. "You're directing it, like a general directing troops." "I suppose so. Why didn't Quintus think of this?" Lucius chose his words carefully. Criticizing a superior to another superior was dangerous, even if that superior was failing. Quintus is building the road the way roads have always been built. He's doing it bigger and stronger because the terrain is harder. But the approach is the same. And your approach? My approach starts with a different question. Not, how do I make the road resist water, but how do I make the water leave? Appius was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. It was not an entirely pleasant smile. "Quintus is relieved of his command. You're taking over the project." Lucius felt the ground shift under him. He'd expected punishment, or at best a cautious commendation. Not this. The entire project? All 212 kilometers. You have 3 years. The Senate is impatient and I am old. I suggest you start immediately. Lucius Pavo didn't just build a road. He built a system. The drainage trenches ran the entire length of the Via Appia. Every kilometer had to be surveyed for gradient. The trenches needed a continuous slight slope to keep water moving. In flat terrain, this meant digging one trench deeper than the other, creating an artificial slope. In hilly terrain, it meant cutting channels into the hillsides to prevent runoff from washing across the road. The 4-layer foundation became standard, but the exact composition varied based on local conditions. In areas with clay soil, the bottom layer of large rocks was thicker. Clay holds water, so you needed more drainage capacity below. In sandy areas, the bottom layer could be thinner because sand drains naturally. In the marshes, Lucius added a 5th layer, bundles of branches and reeds laid crosswise beneath everything else, creating a floating foundation that distributed weight across the soft ground instead of punching through it. The camber, the curved road surface, required precision. Too flat and water would pool. Too steep and carts would slide toward the edges. Lucius settled on a rise of about 1 in 40. For every 40 units of width, the center was 1 unit higher than the edges, barely perceptible to someone walking on the road. Obvious to water, every bridge needed special attention. Water concentrates at bridges. It flows down from the road surface, hits the bridge approach, and has nowhere to go. Lucius designed culverts that passed under the bridge approaches, carrying drainage water to the streams below. Every cutting through a hill needed drainage channels cut into the rock face above, directing groundwater away from the road surface before it could seep through. Every section through marshy ground needed not just the standard system, but additional deep drainage, trenches extending down into the water table itself, lined with rocks, creating permanent channels for groundwater to escape. It took 3.5 years, 11,000 workers at the peak, 412 documented deaths from accidents, disease, and the marsh fevers that never stopped claiming lives. But when it was finished, you could walk from Rome to Capua in any weather, and your feet would be dry. The Via Appia didn't stop at Capua. Rome kept conquering, and as Rome conquered, the road followed. By around 290 BC, at the end of the Third Samnite War, the road reached Beneventum, another 56 kilometers through mountain terrain. The Samnites had called the place Maloenton, Passage of the Flocks. The Romans renamed it Beneventum, Place of Good Events, after crushing the last Samnite resistance nearby. Lucius was dead by then, but the engineers who followed him used his system, the same 4 layers, the same drainage trenches, the same camber. The road climbed into the mountains, and the water kept flowing off it. By 272 BC, after Rome defeated the Greek mercenary king Pyrrhus and captured Tarentum, the road extended again. The new section crossed the dry uplands of Apulia, easier terrain, but the system remained the same. Drainage wasn't optional just because the land wasn't swampy. Every road failed eventually if water couldn't escape. And finally, in 191 BC, with the conquest of the Salentine Peninsula, the Via Appia reached its final destination, Brundisium, modern Brindisi, 500 kilometers from Rome, the gateway to Greece to the east, to everything beyond the Adriatic. 3 different generations of engineers, nearly 120 years of construction, but every kilometer followed the same principles that Lucius had discovered in his 3-kilometer experiment in the marshes. A road isn't a surface. A road is a system. The Via Appia outlived Lucius Pavo. It outlived Appius Claudius. It outlived the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, and every subsequent political entity that controlled the Italian peninsula. It's still there, not remnants or ruins. The actual road. You can walk on it today. The same stones that were laid in 312 BC, still in place, still functional, still carrying traffic 23 centuries later. How is this possible? Every other piece of Roman infrastructure has crumbled, collapsed, or been buried. The aqueducts are ruins. The forums are archaeological sites. The temples are fragments. But the Via Appia endures. The answer is drainage. The system Lucius designed doesn't just protect the road from water damage. It actively maintains the road's foundation. Every rain that falls cleans the drainage channels, flushing out accumulated sediment. Every dry spell lets the foundation dry completely, preventing the slow rot that destroys packed earth. The large rocks at the bottom have never been saturated for extended periods. The gaps between them have never filled with silt. The whole system is self-maintaining in a way that no Roman engineer could have predicted. And there's something else. When the Roman Empire fell, the maintenance stopped. No one was clearing the drainage trenches. No one was repairing damaged stones. The Via Appia should have deteriorated like every other Roman road, but the drainage system was so over-engineered, so much more capacity than strictly necessary, that it kept working even without maintenance. The trenches filled partially with debris, but partially is not completely. Water still found its way out. The foundation stayed dry enough, stable enough, functional enough. For 1,500 years after the last Roman engineer touched it, the Via Appia kept draining itself. In the 1960s, the Italian government decided to restore a section of the Via Appia for tourists. Engineers excavated down through the layers, expecting to find the usual Roman construction, big stones on packed earth. What they found stopped them cold. 4 distinct layers, drainage channels on both sides, a precisely calculated camber, culverts at every low point, a complete water management system that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood hydrology. The 4-layer foundation matched almost exactly what 20th century engineers had determined was optimal for heavy traffic roads. The camber was within 2% of modern specifications. The drainage trenches were positioned and sized in ways that would satisfy current engineering standards. In 2024, the Via Appia was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. 800 kilometers of road from Rome to Brindisi, recognized as one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. The citation noted its outstanding universal value and its influence on road construction throughout history. What it didn't note, what it couldn't note, because the records don't exist, is who actually figured out the principles that made it possible. We don't actually know for certain who developed the drainage system that made Roman roads possible. The historical record credits Appius Claudius Caecus with the Via Appia. He was the politician who commissioned it, funded it, pushed it through against opposition. His name is on the road. His legacy is secure. The engineers who actually built it, their names are mostly lost. We know some of them by fragments, references in other texts, inscriptions on stones, a supervisor mentioned here, a section chief named there. But the complete picture, who invented what, who had the critical insight, who solved the drainage problem, is gone. Lucius Pavo might have been real. He might have been several people whose contributions got merged in later retellings. He might have been a complete invention, a convenient name attached to innovations that emerged from dozens of engineers working independently. It doesn't matter. What matters is that someone stood in the mud and thought, I'm doing this wrong. Everyone is doing this wrong. There has to be a better way. And then they found it, not through genius or inspiration, through observation, through paying attention to what the water did, through the simple act of watching failure and refusing to accept it. That's the story of most engineering breakthroughs. Not brilliant insights from brilliant minds, just people watching things go wrong and stubbornly insisting on understanding why. Modern civil engineers have a saying, it's not the traffic that kills roads, it's the water. A road can handle millions of vehicles passing over it. The weight compresses the surface, but if the foundation is solid, the road springs back. Traffic wears roads down slowly, over decades. Water kills roads in seasons. One winter of water seeping into cracks, freezing, expanding, thawing, seeping deeper. One spring of saturated foundations turning soft under heavy loads. One summer of drought followed by sudden rain. The dry ground unable to absorb the water fast enough. Every modern highway is built on this understanding. Drainage first, surface second. The asphalt you drive on is almost an afterthought. What matters is the elaborate system underneath that keeps water from destroying the foundation. And that system looks almost exactly like what a Roman engineer designed 23 centuries ago. The camber, the drainage ditches, the permeable foundation layers, the careful attention to gradient so water keeps moving instead of sitting still. The Romans didn't have computer modeling. They didn't have soil mechanics or hydrology textbooks. They didn't have any of the tools we use to design roads today. They had observation, they had patience, and they had a willingness to question assumptions that everyone else took for granted. A note on what's real and what's dramatized here. The Via Appia is real. Appius Claudius Caecus is real. The dates, the route, the engineering specifications, all confirmed by archaeological evidence and historical records. The four-layer foundation system is real and has been documented through excavation at multiple points along Roman roads. The Romans called the layers statumen, rudis, nucleus, and summum dorsum. The drainage innovations are real. Roman roads demonstrably used integrated drainage systems, including lateral trenches, cambered surfaces, and permeable foundation layers. The character of Lucius Pavo is fictional. We don't know who actually developed these techniques. The process of innovation I've described, experimentation on a small section, observation of results, eventual adoption as standard practice, is historically plausible but not documented. The dialogue is invented. Romans didn't record engineering discussions the way we might today. What's not invented? The central insight that water management, not surface strength, determines road longevity. This principle is clearly visible in every surviving Roman road, and it took modern engineers nearly 2 millennia to rediscover it independently. Sometimes the most important innovations aren't the ones that look impressive. They're the ones that nobody notices because they just work. There's a section of the Via Appia just south of Rome where you can see the original drainage trench. 23 centuries of weather, war, and neglect. Earthquakes, barbarian invasions, medieval neglect, modern indifference. The stones on top are worn smooth from traffic. Some have cracked. Some have shifted slightly. But the trench is still there, still visible, still lower on one end than the other. If it rained tomorrow, the water would still flow. Not because anyone maintains it, not because anyone planned for it to last this long, just because someone, a very long time ago, understood something simple about how water works. They didn't leave their name. They didn't write treatises, or give speeches, or seek glory. The Falernian wine that spilled in the mud that day is long gone. The merchant who lost it is forgotten, but the trench is still there. They just built something that worked. And then they moved on to the next section.